this guide, we will talk about the chaff enemies. Minoris enemies tend to not receive the most attention compared to other larger threats due to their relatively weak nature. Yet, when in a sufficiently large number and in presence of other bigger enemies, they can easily be the cause of an Astartes' untimely death. There are 3 types of Tyranid Minoris currently, these being the Hormagaunts, Termagants, and Enraged Hormagaunts. For Chaos, there are 4, Tangors with Shield, Cultists, and the Cultist Sniper. With exception to the Termagants and the Cultists, all Minoris have 44 HP on absolute difficulty. The Termagants have 40 HP, while the Cultists have 2. All Minoris enemies hit by a heavy melee attack will be put into a gunstrike state, with exception to the Cultists and a guarding Tangor. Most melee Minoris also have a grab attack that can be countered with a parry. The counter grab will initiate as soon as the player presses the button when the blue marker is present, and will restore 1 segment of armor. Dodging will cause the grab to fail, and the player will then be free to parry as usual. Minoris enemies tend to use this attack when they are first activated by player proximity, or when the player has moved sufficiently far away. There seems to be a 15-second cooldown between each grabs. With exception to the Cultists, Minoris enemies will all be pushed back when the player dodges into them. The Cultists will instead be pulverized. Finally, a perfect parry will kill an attacking Minoris and restore 1 armor segment. Others whose attacks also landed simultaneously will also be killed. Let's take a look at each individual Minoris. Hormagaunts have an 8 times headshot multiplier and a 3 times damage modifier against most damage type available to the player. They deal 1.5 damage per attack and up to 4 can attack the player at once. Termagants have an 8 times headshot multiplier and a 3 times damage modifier to most damage type. Each of their projectiles does 0.1 damage to the player and can headshot for 5 times the damage. It seems that up to 10 Termagants can fire upon a player at once, though it is hard to say for certain since each volley has a very short delay. Enraged Hormagaunts can be spotted by the adrenal sacs on their back, as well as their glowing red eyes. These Hormagaunts only receive 66% damage compared to their normal counterparts, and they also only receive 60% melee damage. They also gain passive poise and cannot be staggered by bullets or light melee attacks. Heavy attacks will still knock them down, however. Tangors, like the Gaunts, also have a 8 times headshot multiplier. Unlike the Tyranid Chaffs, however, they only have a 1 times damage bonus against all types of damage. In effect, this makes them far more difficult to dispatch than the Gaunts. The shielded Tangors are capable of blocking, which reduces incoming damage by 70%. These shields can also be destroyed, but only when the Tangors are actively defending with them. In addition, you can only incur heavy knockdowns on them if they are staggered or if they've lost their shield. Both Tangors do 1.5 damage per strike against the player. Up to 4 Tangors can attack the player simultaneously. Owing to their low HP, Cultists will die to any attack made by the player, even running and rolling. They are surprisingly deadly when in large numbers, however. Regular Cultists are also capable of lobbing frag grenades that deal 10 damage in a 4-meter radius. These are easily avoided if you're paying attention. The Sniper Cultists are very similar to the Venom Cannon Warrior. After gaining distance, they will spend 3.5 seconds aiming at the player. If the player doesn't dodge, he will be hit by a last projectile that deals 11 damage, provided there is no obstacle. A final attack that the Cultist can perform is turning into a Curse of Tzinch, which follows the player and deals 2 points of explosive damage. This can happen as soon as the Cultist is engaged, or after a certain amount of time after the NPC is activated. These have an explosive radius of 1.5 meter and can detonate other curses. Minoris enemies, especially the melee variants, can be overwhelming at first if you do not understand the melee combat. In general, the idea is to generate space and thus gaining priority. Sprint attacks and heavy attacks are the best way to do just that and should be used whenever possible. These attacks will induce heavy knockdowns on the Minoris, and also allow the gun strike one of them. For each archetype, there will be slight variation to these fundamentals. Fencing is the easiest to start off with since the parry timing is extremely lenient. The trade-off, however, is the poor cleave value typical of these weapons, which severely hampers how many units can be damaged by a single attack. In addition, these weapons have the smaller parry stagger radius of 2 meters. Pairing with a fencing weapon is by far the safest and easiest option, but you should never deal with Minoris enemies this way with the other options. Balanced weapons have the most cleave out of all archetypes, as well as the biggest parry stagger radius of 4.5 meters. It unfortunately also has a startup time to its perfect parry, which is by far its biggest drawback. This is especially heinous when you're surrounded by a pack of Minoris, because oftentimes an enemy you're not looking will hit you during the startup window, which locks you into a light block animation. You cannot and should not try to rely on parry as your sole means to dealing with Minoris enemies with a balanced weapon. Leverage on your high cleave to interrupt enemies first, then create space using a heavy or sprint attack. After that, parry or gun strike to regain armor. Unlike fencing or balanced, block weapons cannot stagger or kill Minoris off a perfect block. They also have a middling cleave value. Like balanced weapons, you want to use as many heavy and sprint attacks as possible to generate space. Building Adrenaline Surge is not always a priority, but with some experience you will learn that it's far easier than it would seem. Adrenaline Surge can force stagger up to 100 units with its explosion in a 4.5 meter radius, as well as generate armor. Naturally, all attacks made during its effect will interrupt any and all Minoris enemies. The following section is the perfect block timing for Minoris enemies. There are primary weapons that are specifically designed for quick removal of Minoris enemies, but melee will always remain the most reliable way to dealing with them, regardless of which one. Be comfortable with handling a horde of Tzaangors using your knife. This concludes the video. See you next time.